10 years. For 10 years, Maya had built a new life, brick by painful brick, over the ruins Mark had left behind. But one night, at their high school reunion, he tried to tear it all down. He stood before their old friends, his voice dripping with false pity, painting her as a failure, a washed-up trophy wife who'd traded her soul for security. He thought he had her trapped, shamed and broken. He thought no one would ever see the truth. He never imagined her new life and her new husband would walk through that door. The invitation had been sitting on the marble island in her kitchen for 3 weeks, a crisp, cream-colored rectangle of judgment. Northgate High School class of 2014 10-year reunion. Maya Vale, no, she was Maya Ashford now, traced the embossed crest with a manicured finger, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't the reunion itself that terrified her. It was him, Mark. The name alone was a phantom limb, an ache where a part of her used to be, amputated but never forgotten. Her husband, Rowan Ashford, walked into the kitchen, his quiet presence a stark contrast to the storm in her mind. He was a man carved from a different kind of stone than Mark. Where Mark was loud, brash ambition, Rowan was the silent, unshakable strength of a mountain. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle, his gaze perceptive. "You're thinking about it again," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. It wasn't a question. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "It's ridiculous. Why do I still let him have this power over me? It's been 7 years since the divorce." "Because wounds heal, May, but scars remain. He was your first everything. That kind of history doesn't just evaporate." Rowan's thumb drew a slow circle on her shoulder blade. He understood, more than anyone, the intricate web of her past. He knew the story Mark told the world, the ambitious young lawyer and his supportive, simple wife who just couldn't keep up. But Rowan knew the truth, the constant belittling, the gaslighting, the way Mark had systematically dismantled her confidence until she felt like a ghost in her own life. "I don't want to go," she whispered, turning to face him. His eyes, the color of warm whiskey, held no judgment, only a deep, unwavering affection that still, after 4 years of marriage, sometimes felt too good to be true. "Then we won't," he said simply. That was the thing about Rowan. He never pushed. He offered sanctuary, a quiet place for her to land. It was that very quality that made her want to be stronger. "No, I have to. If I don't, he wins. He'll tell everyone I was too scared to show my face, that I'm hiding." She looked around their kitchen, a sprawling space of glass and steel, overlooking the twinkling lights of downtown Chicago from their penthouse apartment. "He'll say I'm hiding in my gilded cage." The phrase was a direct quote from Mark's last email, a venomous diatribe sent after he'd learned of her engagement to Rowan, a man whose net worth eclipsed Mark's wildest ambitions. Mark had built a successful career as a high-profile litigator, but Rowan Ashford owned the kind of generational wealth that made men like Mark feel small, and Mark hated feeling small. "What he says is a reflection of him, not you," Rowan murmured, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She breathed in his scent, sandalwood and clean linen, a world away from Mark's cloying, expensive cologne that always smelled of insecurity. "Intellectually, I know that," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "But emotionally, I'm still that 24-year-old girl who believed everything he said about me. That I was lucky to have him. That I wasn't smart enough, or ambitious enough, or interesting enough on my own." The night of the reunion arrived like a slow-motion storm cloud. Maya stood before the full-length mirror in their dressing room, a space larger than her first apartment with Mark. She wore a sapphire blue dress, a simple, elegant sheath that Rowan had picked out. It was understated, yet the color made her blue eyes blaze, and the cut hinted at the strength she'd built, both in the gym and in her soul. She had spent the last 4 years rediscovering the woman Mark had tried to erase. With Rowan's quiet encouragement, She had gone back to school, finishing the art history degree she'd abandoned to support Mark's legal career. She'd started a small but successful consultancy firm, helping private collectors authenticate and curate their acquisitions. She was no longer just Mark's ex-wife or Rowan's wife. She was Maya Ashford, respected, knowledgeable, her own person. So why did she feel like an imposter in her own skin tonight? "You look breathtaking." Rowan's voice from the doorway made her jump. He leaned against the frame, already in his suit, a perfectly tailored Tom Ford masterpiece that made him look less like a businessman and more like a movie star. But his eyes weren't on the dress, they were on her face. "But you also look like you're about to face a firing squad." She gave him a weak smile. Same difference. He walked over, his hands finding her waist. "He's going to try and get to you, May. He'll use our old friends as an audience. He'll play the victim, the magnanimous ex-husband who is so worried about you." He mimicked Mark's pompous tone perfectly. "He'll hint that you traded up, that you're nothing but a gold digger. He will try to invalidate everything you've built." "I know," she said, her voice tight. "And what will you do?" Maya looked at her reflection, at the woman staring back at her. The fear was still there, a faint tremor behind her eyes. But underneath it, something else was stirring, a flicker of defiance. The woman Mark had married would have crumbled. The woman Rowan loved was made of sterner stuff. "I will smile," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will be polite, and I will not, under any circumstances, let him see me bleed." Rowan's lips curved into a proud smile. He was supposed to be at a charity gala tonight, a prior commitment he couldn't break. He would join her at the reunion later if he could get away. For the first few hours, she would be on her own. It was a test, she knew. Her own personal Everest. As the chauffeur-driven car sliced through the city streets, each mile brought her closer to the Northgate Country Club, the site of the reunion, and a decade back in time. She clutched her small evening bag, her knuckles white. It wasn't just about seeing Mark, it was about facing the ghosts of who she used to be and proving once and for all that the gilded cage was not a prison but a fortress she had helped build. And tonight, for the first time, she was ready to defend it. The Northgate Country Club was exactly as she remembered it, a sprawling brick monolith of old money and suffocating tradition. The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the ghosts of teenage insecurities, now masked by expensive perfumes, forced smiles, and the quiet hum of professional one-upmanship. It was a symphony of nostalgia and regret, and Maya felt a wave of it wash over her as she stepped through the door. For a moment, she was frozen, an easy target. Faces turned. Whispers erupted like brushfires, and she could feel the collective weight of 10 years of gossip settle upon her. "That's Maya Vale. You know, Mark's ex. Did you hear who she's married to now?" Then a familiar welcome voice cut through the noise. "May, my God, you came!" Jessica Tran, her best friend since kindergarten, broke away from a small group and enveloped her in a fierce hug. Jess, now a sharp-witted pediatrician with 2 kids and a perpetually tired but happy glow, had been her rock during the divorce. She was one of the few who had seen the cracks in Mark's perfect facade from the beginning. "I almost didn't," Maya admitted, her voice tight with tension. "Well, you look incredible, like take no prisoners, burn it all down incredible," Jess said, holding her at arm's length. "That color on you is a power move." Maya managed a genuine smile. "It's my armor for the evening." "Good. You're going to need it. The jackal is holding court by the bar." Maya's eyes instinctively followed Jess's gaze. And there he was, Mark. He hadn't changed much physically. He still had the same sandy blonde hair, the athletic build from his college football days, and the smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. He was surrounded by a rapt audience. Old teammates, former cheerleaders, the people who had always orbited him. He was gesturing with a glass of scotch in his hand, his voice carrying across the room, full of the easy, practiced charm that had once captivated her. He hadn't seen her yet, Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Breathe, May. Just breathe." "Come on," Jess said, grabbing her hand and pulling her towards a quieter corner. "Let's get a drink in you, and you can tell me all about that art deal in Florence. I need to live vicariously through someone who doesn't spend her days looking at pictures of rashes." For the next hour, Maya managed to exist in a carefully constructed bubble. She and Jess reconnected with a few genuinely kind people from their past. Nerdy, sweet David Chen, now a successful app developer, and quiet, artistic Sarah Bell, who owned a thriving floral design business. The conversations were light, safe. They talked about careers, families, the absurdity of getting older. Maya found herself slowly relaxing, the knot in her stomach loosening its death grip. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe he would just ignore her. It was a foolish hope. She saw the exact moment he noticed her. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes, the pale, chilly blue she once thought were so beautiful, narrowed slightly. A predator spotting its prey. He excused himself from his group, his movements smooth and deliberate as he began to weave his way through the crowd towards her. Jess squeezed her arm. "Showtime," she muttered under her breath. "Remember who you are." Maya squared her shoulders, her fingers tightening around the cool glass of her sparkling water. She would not run. She would not hide. "Maya, I almost didn't recognize you," Mark said, stopping in front of them. His voice was a silken sheath over a blade. His eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her body, from her designer heels to her simple pearl earrings, lingering for a moment on the sapphire and diamond ring Rowan had given her. It was a look designed to be both appreciative and dismissive, as if he were appraising livestock. "You clean up well." It was the same backhanded compliment he'd used for years. "You look nice tonight, May. It's amazing what a little effort can do." The old Maya would have flushed and stammered. The new Maya met his gaze without flinching. "Hello, Mark. You haven't changed at all." She delivered the line with a cool, neutral tone, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it with his trademark charm. Still the same old Mark, working hard, fighting the good fight. He turned his smile on Jess. "Jess, great to see you. How's the family?" He was playing the part of the gracious, friendly guy, the bigger person. It was a calculated performance for the people who were now subtly watching their interaction. "We're great, Mark," Jess replied, her tone clipped and cool. Mark's attention snapped back to Maya. "So I hear congratulations are in order. You landed the big one, Rowan Ashford. That's impressive. Must be nice not to have to worry about anything anymore." The first shot had been fired. It was subtle, a carefully worded insinuation lobbed in front of their peers. "You didn't earn your life, you married it." "I'm very happy, Mark," Maya said simply, refusing to take the bait. "Oh, I'm sure you are. It's a long way from our tiny walk-up in Wrigleyville, isn't it?" He laughed, a sound that was meant to be shared and nostalgic, but was edged with something sharp and bitter. "Remember how we used to count pennies to afford pizza on a Friday night? I guess you're eating off gold plates now, huh?" He was building his narrative, piece by piece. He was the salt-of-the-earth guy they all remembered, the one who'd built his success from scratch. She was the one who had taken a shortcut, who had abandoned their shared history for a life of unearned luxury. He was creating a power imbalance, casting himself as the relatable hero and her as the detached, unknowable elite. "I remember our history very well, Mark," she said, her voice dropping a notch, a hint of steel entering her tone. "I remember all of it." His smile tightened. He knew she wasn't just talking about the pizza. She was talking about the nights she'd stayed up typing his briefs, the promising job interviews she'd turned down so she could support his dreams, the inheritance from her grandmother that had paid for his bar exam fees, an investment he had long since forgotten to mention. He was about to retort when someone clapped him on the shoulder. It was Tom Riley, the former quarterback and one of Mark's closest acolytes. "Mark, buddy, we're about to do toasts. You've got to say a few words." Mark's face lit up. An audience, a microphone. It was his natural habitat. He gave Maya a final, condescending smirk. "You'll have to excuse me. Some of us still have to network." He turned and walked towards the stage, leaving Maya standing in the silent, churning wake of his arrival. Jess let out a low whistle. The narcissist has landed, and he's preparing for a public execution. Maya watched him take the stage, her blood running cold. This was worse than she had imagined. He wasn't just going to shame her in a private conversation. He was going to do it in front of everyone. The clinking of a knife against a champagne flute cut through the ballroom's chatter, a high, piercing sound that demanded attention. Every head turned towards the small, makeshift stage where Mark stood, bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight. He held a microphone in one hand and his half-empty glass of scotch in the other, looking every bit the master of ceremonies. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked confident, charming, and completely at ease. Maya knew better. She recognized the predatory gleam in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. This was Mark in his element, a courtroom of his peers, and he was both prosecutor and star witness. "Hey, everyone!" he began, his voice booming through the speakers. A chorus of cheers and whistles answered him. "It is so good to see all of you. 10 years. Can you believe it? Some of us look a little older." He paused for laughter. "Some of us look a little richer." His eyes swept the room and landed, for a pointed second, on Maya. "And some of us are just happy to still be standing." He was a master of insinuation. Each word was a carefully chosen pebble tossed into the pond of public opinion to create ripples of speculation. Maya stood rigid, Jess's hand a warm, steadying presence on her back. She could feel the curious glances of their classmates, their faces a mixture of intrigue and pity. "I look around this room and I see a lot of success stories," Mark continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned sincerity. "Doctors, entrepreneurs, parents, people who have worked their tails off to build something real, something they can be proud of." He took a sip of his scotch, letting the statement hang in the air. The subtext was clear. Real success was earned through struggle, not marriage. His gaze found Maya again, this time holding it. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "And I want to give a special shout-out to my ex-wife, Maya Vale." A murmur went through the crowd. It was audacious, even for Mark. To call her out by her maiden name, to do it so publicly. It was a calculated move to strip her of her current identity and drag her back into a past he controlled. "Some of you might not know, but May and I were high school sweethearts. We built a life together from nothing." He shook his head, a sad, nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "I put everything I had into my career, into building a future for us. And she was right there alongside me, for a while." The phrase, "for a while," was laced with a delicate poison. It suggested she had abandoned the mission, that she had lacked the fortitude to see the struggle through. Maya's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears. He was rewriting their history in real time, painting himself as the hard-working, forsaken husband. "Life takes us in different directions," he went on, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Paths diverge. People change. And while my path was maybe a little steeper, a little harder, I wouldn't trade the grind for anything. It builds character. It teaches you what's really important." He was spinning a web, and she was at the center of it. Every word was designed to diminish her, to frame her present happiness as shallow and unearned. He was preying on the classic trope of the gold digger, a narrative as old as time and just as effective. He knew that in a room full of people who had spent the last decade climbing corporate ladders and paying off mortgages, his story of grit would be far more relatable than her story of marrying a billionaire. A woman near them, someone Maya vaguely remembered as a cheerleader named Tiffany, whispered to her friend, just loud enough to be heard, "Wow, I always wondered what happened with them. He seemed so broken up about it." Maya's stomach churned. It was working. He was casting his spell, and they were all falling under it. "But you know," Mark said, leaning into the microphone, his voice dropping into a confidential, almost confessional tone, "I worry about her sometimes. I do." He looked directly at Maya now, his eyes filled with a theatrical concern that made her skin crawl. When you get handed everything on a silver platter, you can lose touch with reality. You can forget who you are, where you came from. You can forget the people who were there for you when you had nothing. This was the first stone. It wasn't a direct accusation, but an expression of concern. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, framing his cruelty as kindness. He wasn't attacking her, he was worried about her. He was the good guy, the caring ex-husband who just wanted what was best for her. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her reaction. A tear, a denial, an angry outburst. Any emotional response would be a victory for him, proof that his words had hit their mark. Maya took a slow, deliberate breath. She remembered Rowan's words. "He will try to invalidate everything you've built." She remembered her own promise. "I will not let him see me bleed." She raised her chin slightly. She did not look away from Mark's gaze, and she did something he did not expect. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile, not a happy one. It was small, serene, and utterly unreadable. It was the smile of a woman who knew a secret he couldn't possibly comprehend. Her lack of reaction seemed to throw him off balance. He had expected a crack in her composure, a sign of weakness he could exploit. He saw none. He faltered for a moment, his folksy charm evaporating, revealing the raw animosity beneath. He recovered quickly, ending his toast with a flourish. "So, here's to the class of 2014, to hard work, to real success, and to never forgetting who you are." A smattering of applause broke the tension, but it was hesitant. Mark had overplayed his hand slightly. The attack had been too personal, too pointed. He had made people uncomfortable, but the damage was done. The first stone had been cast, and Maya knew it was only a matter of time before the rest of the crowd felt emboldened to pick up theirs. Mark's toast had changed the atmosphere of the room. It was as if he'd pulled a thread that began to unravel the polite social fabric of the evening. The air, once filled with cheerful reminiscence, was now charged with the electric hum of gossip. Maya felt like a specimen under glass, the subject of 100 silent conversations. The whispers were everywhere, discreet but palpable. She could see them in the quick, sidelong glances, the heads bent together in conspiratorial huddles, the sudden silences that fell when she walked past a group. Jess, fiercely loyal, tried to run interference. "Don't listen to them, May. They're vultures. They feed on this stuff." But the judgments were impossible to ignore. They were subtle, delivered not in outright accusations, but in the careful phrasing of questions. "Maya, it's so good to see you." It was Bethany Wells, a woman who had peaked in high school as the queen bee and now seemed desperate to cling to any semblance of social relevance. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were sharp and probing. "We were all so surprised to hear about you and Mark. You two seemed so perfect. And then, wow, Rowan Ashford. What a whirlwind that must have been." The implication was clear. How did someone like you land someone like him so quickly? "It's been a wonderful 4 years," Maya replied evenly, refusing to elaborate. Her brevity was a shield, but Bethany saw it as a challenge. "I can imagine. I saw your picture in Chicago Monthly last winter from that hospital fundraiser. The Ashford Foundation, right? It must be incredible being a part of that. So different from, bake sales and PTA meetings." Bethany's laugh was brittle. It was a classic mean girl tactic. Feign admiration while simultaneously highlighting their perceived differences to create a sense of otherness. She was reminding everyone that Maya no longer belonged to their world. Before Maya could respond, Scott Peterson, one of Mark's former football buddies, sauntered over, a beer in his hand and a smug look on his face. "Vale! Or Ashford, I guess. Mark was just telling us about the old days. Man, we were broke back then. But we had fun, didn't we? Nothing beats earning your first real paycheck, you know. He clapped Mark, who had conveniently reappeared on the back. This guy's a killer in the courtroom. Built his firm from the ground up. You must be so proud of him. The question was a deliberate jab designed to force her into an awkward position. If she agreed, she validated Mark. If she disagreed, she looked bitter. Mark's ambition was always one of his defining qualities, she said, her voice a carefully polished surface. It was the truth, but stripped of any warmth. Mark draped an arm around Scott's shoulders, playing the part of the magnanimous leader. "Oh, that's ancient history, Scotty. We've all moved on to bigger and better things." He looked at Maya. "Some of us just had to climb a taller ladder to get there." The whispers grew louder, the judgments more pronounced. Each interaction was a small paper cut, insignificant on its own, but collectively they were beginning to bleed her resolve. Mark had successfully poisoned the well. He had framed the narrative, and now his allies were reinforcing it. They saw him as the self-made man, the relatable guy from their shared past. They saw her as an outsider who had cashed in her ticket for an easy life. The most painful part was the silence of those who should have known better. People she had considered friends, people who had been to her and Mark's first apartment, who had seen her working 2 jobs to support them while he was in law school. They now stood by, their faces averted, unwilling to challenge Mark's version of events. Their silence was a form of complicity, a quiet endorsement of his cruelty. It fed her deepest fear, that Mark had been right all along, that she was forgettable, insignificant, her contributions easily erased from history. She retreated to a small, empty table in the corner, needing a moment to breathe. The ballroom felt like it was closing in on her, the cheerful music a mocking counterpoint to the turmoil in her chest. She watched Mark work the room, laughing, shaking hands, accepting pats on the back. He was glowing with a victor's confidence. He was not just shaming her, he was rallying support, solidifying his social standing at her expense. This was his hidden motive, she realized. It wasn't just about hurting her, it was about power. In their small shared world of Northgate High alumni, he was re-establishing his dominance. He was settling a score that had nothing to do with their marriage and everything to do with his own fragile ego, which had been wounded by her marrying a man far more successful than he could ever hope to be. A figure approached her table, and she braced herself for another assault. But it was David Chen, the quiet tech developer from earlier. He held 2 bottles of water, offering one to her. I thought you might need this," he said, his eyes kind. "He's being a real jerk." Tears pricked Maya's eyes, a sudden sharp sting of gratitude. "Thank you, David. I remember how you used to help me with my calculus homework in the library, even when you were swamped with your own stuff," he said, sitting down. "And I remember you spotting me $20 for a concert ticket when my dad had cut off my allowance. You were always one of the good ones, May." His simple act of decency was a lifeline in a sea of judgment. It was a reminder that not everyone had bought into Mark's lies. "He's telling everyone I'm some kind of kept woman," she said, her voice trembling slightly. David snorted. "Anyone who believes that is an idiot." Mark was always an expert at making himself look good by making other people look bad. Some things never change. Their quiet conversation was a brief reprieve, but it was interrupted by the booming of Mark's voice once again. He was back on the stage, a fresh drink in his hand. "All right, everyone, settle down," he called out. "A few of us were just talking, and we thought it would be fun to share some where are they now stories. But let's make it interesting. Let's talk about our biggest failure on the road to success, because that's where the real learning happens, right?" His eyes found Maya across the room, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He was raising the stakes, preparing to deliver the killing blow. He was going to turn her life into a cautionary tale. Mark's new game was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By framing it as a discussion of failure, he gave himself license to be brutally personal under the guise of honest reflection. He started with a self-deprecating story about his first failed business venture, a lawn-mowing enterprise in high school that charmed the crowd and cemented his image as a relatable, humble guy. He then passed the microphone to a few of his friends who shared sanitized anecdotes about bad investments or career missteps, all with neat, happy endings. It was all a carefully constructed preamble, a warm-up for the main event. Maya watched, her dread mounting with each speaker. She knew the microphone was moving with purpose, a weapon being passed from hand to hand until it reached its intended target. The room was a pressure cooker, and she was at its center. Finally, Mark reclaimed the stage. "This has been great, guys. A real lesson in resilience." He paused, his expression shifting to one of deep, sorrowful contemplation. "But it gets me thinking about a different kind of failure. Not a business failure, but a personal one." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping past Maya as if he were just speaking to the room at large, but the focus of his energy was unmistakable. "You can have all the success in the world, but it doesn't mean much if you lose yourself along the way. I once knew someone who had so much potential, so much light. She was an artist, brilliant. She could have done anything." Maya's breath hitched. He was talking about her. He was talking about the paintings she used to create, the passion she had poured onto canvases in the small studio apartment they once shared. The passion he had first encouraged, then slowly, methodically extinguished with his criticism and indifference. "But she got scared," Mark continued, his voice resonating with pity. "She let her fear of failure paralyze her. She gave up on her dreams. She chose the easy path, a comfortable life, a beautiful home. But at what cost? What happens when you trade your soul for security?" The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact narrative he had used to control her for years. He had convinced her that her art was a childish hobby, that her ambitions were unrealistic, and that her only real value was in supporting his. Now, he was presenting this distorted reality as a tragic tale of her own making. He was erasing his role as the architect of her insecurity and recasting himself as the mournful witness to her downfall. He was unraveling her thread by thread in front of everyone they had ever known. "And the saddest part," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is that I don't think she even realizes what she's lost. She's living in a beautiful gilded cage, but she's forgotten how to fly." He finally turned his gaze directly to her, his eyes filled with a chilling mixture of pity and contempt. "I see her now, and all I see is a ghost of the girl I used to know. And that, my friends, is a tragedy." Silence, thick, suffocating silence. He had done it. He had painted her as a hollow shell, a failure not of career, but of character, a woman who had sold her very essence for a life of luxury. It was a perfect, damning portrait, and in the shocked, pitying faces of her classmates, she could see that they believed him. The carefully constructed walls of her composure began to crumble. The sapphire dress felt like a costume, her confidence a fragile mask. Underneath, she was that 24-year-old girl again, the one who looked in the mirror and saw only what Mark told her was there. Not enough. Never enough. The room began to spin, the faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of judgment. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were a roar in her ears. Gold digger, failure, empty, ghost. Jess grabbed her hand, her knuckles white. "May, breathe! He's lying! It's all lies!" But the lies were so potent because they were built around a kernel of her own buried fears. Had she taken the easy way out? Was her life with Rowan, as wonderful and loving as it was, a beautiful distraction from her own abandoned potential? Mark's poison was working because it was activating a poison she had been carrying inside herself for years. He had won. He had stripped her bare, exposed her deepest insecurities, and invalidated her entire existence in less than 5 minutes. He stepped off the stage, not looking at her, his work complete. He was immediately surrounded by sympathetic friends, offering him a consoling pat on the shoulder, their expressions confirming that they saw him as the noble, wounded party. Maya felt a desperate need to flee, to run from the room, from the pitying stares, from the suffocating weight of Mark's narrative. She took a half step towards the exit, her vision tunneling. And then, the grand ballroom doors at the far end of the room swung open. A man stepped inside. He wasn't loud or ostentatious, but his presence seemed to suck the very air out of the room. He was tall and impeccably dressed, but it was the aura of quiet, unshakable authority that commanded instant attention. He stood for a moment, his whiskey-colored eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, discerning intelligence. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, but the room's entire social ecosystem seemed to shift and recalibrate around him. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were not filled with gossip and judgment, but with awe and disbelief. "Is that— Oh my God, it is! That's Rowan Ashford!" He saw her. Across the crowded room, his eyes found hers. The noise, the judgment, the crushing weight of Mark's words. It all seemed to fade into the background. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His gaze was a lifeline, a silent promise. "I'm here." He began to walk towards her, his stride unhurried and deliberate. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Mark, in the middle of his circle of sympathizers, turned to see what had caused the commotion. His face, flushed with victory just moments before, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving behind a pasty, shocked pallor. The hunter had just realized that a much larger, more dangerous predator had entered his territory. Rowan's entrance was not an arrival. It was an event. He moved through the ballroom with an economy of motion that bespoke a man utterly comfortable in his own skin, a man for whom rooms like this were not a stage for performance, but simply a space to be occupied. The collective gaze of the Northgate High alumni followed him, a ripple of silent awe and frantic reassessment spreading through the crowd. This was not just a successful man. This was a different echelon of existence, a name they read in the Wall Street Journal, not in the local paper. Mark and his coterie were frozen mid-sentence, their self-congratulatory bubble instantly burst. Mark's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, disbelief, fury, and a sudden, stark awareness of his own provincial status. He, who had just spent the last hour meticulously crafting his image as the self-made king of their small pond, was now face to face with an ocean. Rowan didn't so much as glance in Mark's direction. His focus was entirely on Maya. As he drew closer, he saw the tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the fragile way she held herself together. His expression, which had been neutral and observant, softened with a deep, protective tenderness that was meant only for her. He reached her and, without a word, took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, a solid anchor in her swirling sea of panic. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a small, intimate gesture that was somehow more powerful and declarative in this public space than any grand pronouncement. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. The gala was interminable. "Rowan," she breathed, his name a prayer of relief. "What are you doing here?" "You're my wife," he answered simply, as if that were the only explanation necessary in the world. He turned his attention to Jess. "Jessica, it's good to see you." "You too, Rowan," Jess said, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. "Your timing is impeccable." Rowan's gaze finally drifted from Maya, sweeping over the room. He took in the stunned faces, the awkward silence, and then, finally, he allowed his eyes to land on Mark. He didn't glare. He didn't glower. He simply looked. It was a calm, appraising gaze, the kind a geologist might give a common rock. In that single dismissive glance, he stripped Mark of all his bluster and bravado, rendering him small and insignificant. Mark, recovering some of his composure, puffed out his chest and took a step forward, forcing a bravado he clearly didn't feel. "Ashford, I'm Mark Reynolds, Maya's ex-husband. We haven't been formally introduced." He stuck out his hand, a desperate attempt to assert some form of equality, to prove he belonged in the same ring. Rowan looked down at the offered hand for a long moment, not with contempt, but with a kind of detached curiosity. Then he looked back up at Mark's face, his expression unreadable. He made no move to shake it. "An introduction isn't necessary," Rowan said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity in the silent room. "I know who you are." The simple statement was devastating. It implied a history, a knowledge that went beyond a simple name. The hand Mark had offered hung in the air for a painful second before he awkwardly let it drop to his side. A flush of angry humiliation crept up his neck. Rowan turned his body slightly, creating a subtle but unmistakable barrier between Mark and Maya. He had taken control of the space, of the entire dynamic, without raising his voice or making a single threatening move. His power wasn't in what he did, but in what he didn't need to do. "I believe you were entertaining everyone with stories," Rowan said, his eyes still on Mark. "Something about failure?" Mark swallowed hard. "Just some old friends sharing stories. You know how it is?" "I'm not sure I do," Rowan replied, his tone still mild, almost conversational. "My wife is one of the most resilient and courageous people I have ever met. Her definition of success might differ from yours. You see, she measures it not by the noise you make, but by the quiet integrity with which you build a life. Not by the dreams you loudly proclaim, but by the ones you quietly, diligently achieve." Each word was a precise, surgical cut, dismantling the very foundation of the narrative Mark had so carefully constructed. He wasn't just defending Maya, he was redefining the terms of the entire debate. Maya stared at him, her heart swelling with a feeling so immense she could hardly contain it. He hadn't stormed in, fists swinging. He hadn't caused a scene. He was defending her with his intelligence, his dignity, and his unwavering belief in her. He was showing everyone in the room the man he was, and in doing so, he was showing them the woman he saw when he looked at her. The onlookers were captivated. This was a drama far more compelling than Mark's self-pitying monologue. It was a quiet, deadly clash of two vastly different kinds of power. One was loud, insecure, and built on the subjugation of others. The other was quiet, absolute, and rooted in conviction. "I think," Rowan said, his gaze finally releasing Mark and turning to the rest of the room, a hint of steel now underlying his calm tone, "that the game is over." He then looked back at Maya, his face softening once more. "Shall we get some air?" He didn't wait for an answer. Keeping her hand firmly in his, he began to lead her away from the toxic epicenter of the room. The crowd once again parted for them. They walked past the stunned faces, the open mouths, the dawning comprehension in the eyes of their classmates. As they reached the doors, Maya chanced one last look back. Mark was standing alone, his former audience having subtly drifted away, not wanting to be associated with the losing side. He looked deflated, his cheap victory having turned to ash in his mouth. For the first time that night, he looked exactly like what he was, a bully who had just been put in his place. The cool night air was a balm on Maya's flushed skin. Rowan led her through a set of French doors onto a deserted stone terrace overlooking the golf course. The manicured green, bathed in the silvery light of the moon, was a landscape of perfect, ordered calm, a world away from the social battlefield inside. For a long moment they stood in silence, the distant sound of the party a muted thrum behind them. Maya finally let out a shuddering breath, the tension of the last few hours releasing from her body in a wave. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Rowan said, turning to face her, his hands finding hers and holding them gently. "I did. I will not stand by and allow someone to speak about my wife that way, ever. He made me feel so small," she confessed, the shame of it still clinging to her. For a minute there, I almost believed him. I almost believed I was that person he described. He described a ghost, Rowan said, his voice firm, a fiction he created to soothe his own ego. The woman I see is a brilliant art consultant who single-handedly brokered the acquisition of a Monet for one of the most demanding collectors in the world. The woman I see is a partner, my most trusted advisor. The woman I see just secured a seat on the board of the Children's Literacy Foundation. A ghost couldn't do that, May. Only a formidable woman could. He was listing her accomplishments, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact. He was holding up a mirror, forcing her to see the reflection he saw, the truth that Mark's vitriol had tried to obscure. Just then, the French doors opened again. It was Mark. His face was a thunderous mask of rage. The public humiliation had festered, and his need for confrontation had overridden any sense of self-preservation. "I need to talk to you," he snarled, pointing a finger at Maya. "Alone." Rowan stepped forward slightly, a subtle but impassable shield. "I don't think so." "This is between me and her," Mark insisted, his voice rising. "This is about our history. You have no idea what we went through." "Oh, but I think I do," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. The calm conversationalist was gone, replaced by a man of cold, hard authority. "I know, for instance, about the inheritance your wife received from her grandmother, the one that paid for your law school tuition and bar exam fees. An inheritance that was never repaid, not even acknowledged. I suppose that was part of the struggle you built your career on." Mark's jaw went slack. He looked as if Rowan had slapped him. How did you know that?" "When I fell in love with Maya, I made it my business to understand everything she had been through," Rowan said, his eyes like chips of ice. "I know about the job offer she had from the Art Institute of Chicago, the one you convinced her to turn down because it would have required her to travel, and you needed her home to type your briefs and host dinners for your partners. You called it a sacrifice for our future. An interesting term for sabotaging your wife's career to advance your own." Maya stared at Rowan, stunned. She had told him these things, of course, in quiet, tearful confessions over the years. But to hear them laid out so clinically, so factually, as evidence in a case against Mark, it was breathtaking. Rowan hadn't just listened to her pain, he had catalogued the injustices. "And I know," Rowan continued, his voice relentless, "that after your first big case, when you bought yourself a Porsche, you told Maya there wasn't enough money left for her to take the master's program she'd been accepted to, even though the tuition was less than a quarter of the price of your car." Mark was pale, stumbling backwards a step. "That's not... It was more complicated than that." "Was it? Or was it simply that your success required her failure, that for you to feel big, she had to be kept small?" Rowan took a step closer, and for the first time, Mark looked genuinely afraid. "You didn't just divorce her, Mr. Reynolds. You tried to systematically dismantle her. Her confidence, her ambition, her sense of self-worth. You speak of a gilded cage, but the only cage Maya was ever in was the one you built for her, brick by brick, with your insults, your condescension, and your monumental selfishness." The truth, delivered in Rowan's cold, precise monotone, was more damning than any angry shout. It sucked all the oxygen from the terrace. Mark stood exposed, not as a wronged ex-husband, but as a petty, emotional abuser. His hidden motives were no longer hidden. They were laid bare for all to see. It was never about love or history. It was about jealousy. The professional jealousy of a man who resented his wife's potential, and the personal bitterness of a man who couldn't stand to see her happy and thriving with someone else. "So you are correct," Rowan concluded, his voice softening slightly as he turned his gaze back to Maya. "This is about your history, and I am here to ensure that history no longer has the power to harm her." He then looked back at Mark, his expression one of finality and dismissal. "You are a footnote in my wife's story, Mr. Reynolds. I suggest you learn to accept that." With that, Rowan took Maya's hand, turned his back on the sputtering, defeated man, and led her away from the terrace, leaving Mark alone with the wreckage of his own lies. It wasn't a loud victory, but a quiet one, a quiet defense that had roared like a lion. When Rowan and Maya stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere was electric. The confrontation on the terrace hadn't been seen, but the shift in power that occurred when Rowan arrived was still palpable. Mark stumbled in a moment later, his face ashen, his bravado utterly gone. He looked like a deflated balloon, and the sight of his defeat was a truth more potent than any gossip. He avoided everyone's eyes, making a beeline for the bar, where he downed a glass of scotch in one go. The spell was broken. The narrative Mark had so carefully woven had been shredded. People who had been quick to offer him sympathy and join in the judgment of Maya now seemed uncertain, their allegiances shifting in the face of a new, undeniable reality. They began to look at Maya differently, not with pity, but with a dawning respect. They were seeing her not through Mark's tainted lens, but as the woman who stood beside Rowan Ashford, her equal in grace and quiet strength. Jess and David Chen rushed over, their faces beaming. "That was," Jess said, searching for the right word, "biblical. I've wanted to see someone put him in his place for 10 years. David just shook his head in admiration. He didn't even raise his voice. But the true reckoning was yet to come. It wouldn't come from Rowan. It would come from Maya herself. Bolstered by Rowan's unwavering defense, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet for the first time all night, she felt a profound shift within her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. An anger not just at Mark, but at herself, forever letting him convince her she was less than she was. She saw Bethany Wells and Scott Peterson, two of Mark's most vocal supporters, huddled near the hors d'oeuvres table, casting nervous glances in her direction. The old Maya would have ignored them, would have been content with her private victory. The new Maya, the woman Rowan saw, walked directly towards them. They fell silent as she approached, their discomfort obvious. "Bethany," Maya began, her voice calm and steady. "You mentioned earlier how different my life must be now. You're right, it is. For instance, my husband doesn't see my dreams as a threat to his own. He doesn't tell me my passions are foolish hobbies. He celebrates my success instead of trying to sabotage it. That's the primary difference, not the money." Bethany's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Maya then turned to Scott. "And Scott, you said you were proud of Mark for building his firm from the ground up. You should know, the seed money for that firm came from my grandmother's inheritance, an investment I made in him because I believed in him. An investment he conveniently forgets to mention when he's telling his heroic origin story." Scott looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at Maya. The truth of her words, delivered without malice but with unshakable conviction, had the undeniable ring of authenticity. She wasn't finished. Her voice rose slightly, not in a shout, but enough to draw the attention of those standing nearby. "For years, I let Mark define me. I let his voice become the only voice I could hear in my head. He told me I was weak, so I felt weak. He told me I was nothing without him, and I believed him." She looked across the room at Mark, who was watching the scene unfold, trapped and powerless. But he was wrong. The words were simple, but they resonated with the force of a revelation. It was her declaration of independence, spoken not just to the room, but to the ghost of the girl she used to be. "My life didn't begin when I met Rowan Ashford. It began when I left Mark Reynolds. Everything I have because I finally started believing in myself. The love and support of a good man was the fortunate tailwind, but I was the one who learned to fly again." Her speech was met with a stunned silence. She had not only defended herself, she had reclaimed her own story. She had taken the ugly, twisted narrative Mark had created and set it on fire. In its place, she had offered them the truth, and it was far more compelling. The reckoning was quiet, but absolute. It was in the ashamed faces of those who had been so quick to judge her. It was in the newfound respect in the eyes of her old classmates. It was in the way Bethany couldn't meet her gaze, and Scott suddenly found his shoes fascinating. And then a sound broke the silence. Applause. It started with Jess and David, but it spread. Sarah Bell, the florist, began to clap. A few others joined in. It wasn't a thunderous ovation, but a ripple of support, an acknowledgement of her courage. Rowan had been standing back, allowing her to have her moment. Now he came to her side, his eyes shining with pride. He took her hand and squeezed it. Maya Vale Ashford looked around the room, at the faces of the people she had grown up with. She was no longer a ghost here. She was real, she was whole, and she was, finally, free. The reunion was no longer a lion's den. It was just a room full of people, and she was no longer afraid. Maya's story is a powerful reminder that our past doesn't have to define our future. It shows that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about having the courage to get back up and reclaim your own narrative. She fought back against the lies not with anger, but with the quiet dignity of the truth, proving that the most powerful voice you can have is your own. Her journey from a gilded cage to a life of authentic freedom is an inspiration to anyone who has ever felt small. If this story of betrayal, redemption, and the incredible power of self-worth resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more emotional stories that feel like real life.